Now, I think we will start the panel discussion, and I invite you all to be a part of this session.
So, I have a fundamental question on, is it a good idea to compare, most of the meditations are reducing cortisol and are useful for stress relief, and most of them have all these good qualities. So is it a good idea to compare the decrease in cortisol across meditations and see which meditation is good enough to quieten the mind faster? And the flip side of it is, I have heard Nagaratna Didi to be slowing down. The quest for quietening the mind faster, is it a good idea at all?
Yeah, this is a very general question. I think any of us can take it up. I will just start with, and you can continue. See, meditative techniques in general, try to definitely helps to bring the harmony between mind and body. The techniques what they use may be of different types, but its effect on the body and mind, the physiology, finally reaches a common final path. See, for example, it calms down your mind, and that can be tested with the hot cortisol, or even the release of various other feel-good hormones like dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, various other hormones. And also in general, some of the techniques helps to activate the awareness, attention, and also self-regulation, discovery, self-development, and so on. And finally, the final outcome can be the development of various mental attributes, higher mental attributes. So these are all commonalities, but each techniques definitely will be having some of their specificities also. So I think I invite now Jyoti to enlighten upon us on the Buddhist meditation, for example.
Actually, the question that you have put is about comparing the, for example, cortisol levels across different meditative traditions. When it comes to that point, I feel at a physiological level, if you compare cortisol levels across different meditative types, it's more or less you are going to, I feel it's going to give the same result. But it is the experience that's going to differ with each meditative type. So that quantification of an experience would be difficult. So I don't think that there would be significant differences. All of the meditative traditions try to bring in a relaxed state, and they are focused upon decreasing the stress levels. So naturally cortisol will come down because of any meditative practice, and not only meditative practice, other physical exercise also. So this will not make much difference, but the experiences might be different.
I just wanted to share with you some of our studies, especially from our lab. It is not necessary also to bring down the cortisol level. That also there actually. See, for example, the ardent meditators, the Vipassana meditators, what we have observed that a lot of relaxation in terms of what she has already described, the enhanced theta alpha. Not only with Vipassana meditation, we have also observed with the Raja Yoga meditation also. But in these meditators, we have seen an enhancement of various other hormones like melatonin. Melatonin enhancement is seen, whereas we didn't see much decrease of cortisol levels. So it's overall the wellness we are looking into actually. So cortisol need not be, cortisol levels are almost equal to the normal control actually. Whereas the rest of the hormones, for example, melatonin, for example, DHEA, another biologically important hormone, DHEA also has been shown to be enhanced. All these have they have got a physiological effect also. They bring down the anxiety and other negative effect. Anybody can contribute from the audience also, you are welcome.
Sir, my question to Dipankarji. At the take-home message, you mentioned 3-3 breathing exercises for executing the higher functions in our day-to-day life. Can this 3 minutes breathing exercise will be used in patients which are panic? I'm a doctor. Many of the times, the patient comes to hospital with various illnesses. Illness remain at their one particular place, but he become more panic. We ask them to take deep breath, but as per your demonstration or presentation is concerned, you have given us a background knowledge. Why I wanted to meditate. With that background knowledge, I become more eager to do. I become almost eager, anxious to start with this background, with this exercise. Can it be effective for those particular patients or even relatives? Can you highlight on this particular matter? What will be the modifications in that particular exercise?
Yeah, see, in fact, while I was sitting down, I was thinking of this modification. Because there is no canned pitch, and we have to, like Dr. Jyoti was saying also, that different objects of meditation are according to different people. And I have a background in yoga therapy from the Yoga Institute in Bombay, where I was working for many years. So, for a person who's got a more stable mind, the person can actually just work with the full body, or just with the diaphragm, or just with this. Or a person who's on the run can just to center do that. But there may be a person who's actually having a lot of attention deficit, and maybe 3-3 may also not be in a stage of panic. So I could even go and say, just concentrate once in the full body, just once on the stomach, just once here. So I can go to 1-1-1 also. So that will allow the person to shift attention, but you will be actually then systematizing the shift, and that will help to slow down. So from that 1-1-1, you can go to 2-2-2 to 3-3-3, and then you can actually monitor the progress of that person over that period of time. Certainly, yes. Make sense what I'm saying? Yeah. I think
Yes, to Dr. Jyoti. Madam, you showed the graph of a teacher meditator and a monk meditator and a senior meditator. What is the analysis you made? And was the result due to the practice of meditation exclusively, and did you make any report of their practice of values also? Have you studied their background also? Can you please elaborate?
Actually, in our study, we have taken meditators based on their experience level. That is, we have categorized meditators into novices, that is, who have just got introduced to the technique of Vipassana meditation. And then we have taken practitioners who have undergone long retreats, like 45-day course, 30-day courses like that. And then we have teachers who actually conduct these courses. So we have categorized into these 3 levels, and while considering them for the participation, we have taken their details, like their health conditions, their background, their education, their whatever profession, and all these things we have considered, and we have in our research session we asked them to meditate in the same way that they meditate at the center. And during, these are called time locked instructions, we specifically told them to do Anapana, and we asked them to do Vipassana, and we asked them to do Metta. And during the time locked period, we recorded their brain activity, and we could see the differences in the brain activity while they are in that state, and we could see the differences across the proficiency levels. Novices differed from seniors, seniors differed from teachers. And we have also taken their wellness, which they have reported is because of meditation. We have created a wellness scale and asked them how the factors of improvement, like as I told you, wholesome factors in, for example, generosity, or certain factors, compassion, if they have gone up or if they have gone down, or envy, avarice, jealousy, if they have gone up or gone down. So we have taken and compared the brain findings with the objective findings with the subjective experience. So this was our methodology of our study. The result is that we have seen that the meditators actually process the object, the stimulus. They have a different processing mechanisms altogether. So there is a what is called a perception change, outlook change, that is getting reflected as the changes in the neuronal patterns. So what we have seen is theta alpha increases are occurring even in the rest state. For example, if you take an EEG of just a regular person who is not used to so much of meditation, you don't find so much of theta alpha change. Whereas in a meditator, you are seeing consistent, statistically significant theta alpha changes. So which are reflecting some changes in the brain processing methods. We have seen improved cognitive performance, that is the way their attention is being manipulated. We have seen the way they gate the stimuli, that is how they block unwanted stimuli and how they allow the necessary stimuli. And we have seen how they, what is called the P300 wave we have examined. It actually represents the attention processing mechanisms, and we have that reflects the way they mentally represent the object. So cognitive processing has differed, and the way they look at the objects, salience processing, error processing, we have noted some changes. And in the resting state, even without any activity, there is some theta alpha differences which reflect that their mind wandering has come down. The default mode network is that what Deepankaji is suggesting, the state of the mind keeps on jumping from object to object. So that has substantially come down. Probably we are proposing that theta alpha is an indication of the reduction in the state of mind wandering, and theta alpha is also considered to be an improvement, a decreased, probably a decreased self-referential processing. The more the more he becomes objective, the more theta alpha would be rising up. That is our we are in the state of coming up to that conclusions. So the default mode network itself is altered. These are some of the findings. I'm sorry? Practice of values, okay. Yeah, right. Yeah, we have submitted actually my thesis is on that. It is we have seen just the objective findings, we have documented the subjective, and we still have to correlate the objective and the subjective findings. That is yet to be done.
My question to Deepankaji, I'm just curious to know why in Buddhist meditation the head is little tilted to right. What is the reason of tilting the head little right?
You know, the techniques in all the meditations of all the Indian philosophies are as, vast as the flora and fauna of the Amazon forest. Let me tell you that. Let me start with that. But I think it is basically, as you know, we don't breathe from both the nostrils. So slight tilt essentially means that I am breathing from my lunar side. So it's basically to activate the right brain. So it's symbolic of that. We were talking about certain slides in which on the right side there were more activity for meditators, so it is got to be essential.
in the morning we had a Om meditation with an Om symbol, and in the afternoon you showed a picture, but you didn't quite discuss it.
Yes.
So would you like to give a
Can
couple
we
of
have that
minutes?
on? Yeah, yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. 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 So I am not saying that it is like that. I say this is my thinking. It is not a scriptural, what you call representation I'm giving you, but this is how I was taught. That you need to keep it slightly this, and that was my, just write this here, SID. See, this is actually, this picture represents that all that I spoke about today, and all what all of us spoke about today. And essentially it's the wheel of life, or what we call Sipai Kollo. And it is based on the principle of Pratitha Samutpad, which is also called dependent arising, or also conditioned co-production. And so the beginning becomes, this pig is ignorance. And out of this ignorance, you see that there's a bird and a snake coming out, which is Rag and Dvesh. Okay. It's also a little pixelated, but I'll take you through it. And because of our innate ignorance and attachment and aversion, we generate karma. And the sum total of each life is a positive or negative karma, which takes us to either higher or lower states of rebirth. So the higher states are the state of the gods, the asuras, the human beings. The lower states are of the animals, the pretas and the hell beings. But even if we don't want to believe in these realms, we don't want to believe in an afterlife, at a psychological level, to the gods is attributed pride. To the asuras is jealousy. To the human beings is desire. To the animals is cupidity. To the pretas is greed. To the hell beings is anger. And each one of us can actually be going through all these same cycles in one lifetime. We have animals who live in AC rooms. We have human beings who live in rat-infested ghettos. We have these fights between Coke and Pepsi, between the gods and the titans. So these things keep on happening, and they say this is all dependent on the 12 interdependent links of origination. So this is ignorance, which is a blind man, giving rise to a karma, which gives rise to a quality of consciousness, a monkey jumping from one branch of the tree to another. So if I have ignorance, I have karma and a consciousness, then I have Nam Roop, name and form. If I have a name and form, I have my 6 senses, the 5 senses and my mind. When there is a mind, it comes in contact with sense objects, which gives rise to desire. Desire gives rise to craving. Craving gives rise to grasping. Now, again, the sum total of my consciousness, my samskaras and vasanas, there is a point, probably when there is a desire and a craving, maybe somewhere here I can stop it and break that habitual pattern. But if I allow the craving to continue, then it becomes difficult. So that's why those qualities of being able to control my passion, this, that, needs to be controlled. And from there, if I cannot, then there is grasping, there is conception, birth, old age, sickness and death. So I keep on going round and round and round, and that is what I say. For some people who are good with life, the circle is much larger. For some people who can't handle life, it's spinning much faster. Sickness, you actually feel the suffering much more. Yeah, the gods and the asuras, there's so much of pleasure, there's so much of power, they can't think of enlightenment. For the animals, people in the hell beings in this. There's so much of suffering they can't think of. They're just thinking of survival. So it's only in the human realm that we can think of, coming out of it. And while all this is happening, we are actually clutched between the talons and the, fangs of the Lord of Death. We're just going round and round. And the Buddha is there. And he's pointing to the moon, which is a symbol of enlightenment. He's saying, come out of this. Come out of this cycle. Strive towards enlightenment. So that is what it is. So both upaya and prajna, wisdom, method and wisdom, we have to apply skillfully, with skillful means, upaya kaushalya, to be able to reach to a state of Buddhahood. That is what it is. Yeah. Yes.
Famous philosopher, everybody knows.
Yes.
He used to say in the lectures, he never say, I am going to speak. The speaker on the dais, he used to say, Jiddu Krishnamurti,
Yes.
Yeah.
who is from Theosophical Society
Yeah.
and established Rishivel School.
Yes.
He never says,
Yes.
anywhere in his speeches.
Yes.
The speaker on the dais used to begin.
Yes.
Now that is called the correlation of I.
Yeah.
Speaker. He is always
The speaker.
speaker
Yes. Yes.
who is speaking on the dais. That's all. He never says
I.
I.
Over to Dr. Bindu.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Maybe just last question.
Okay. Yeah.
You were talking about acetylation of histones resulting in DNA expression. And so my question is, can DNA expression can be taken as an evolution and possibly carried forward for the next lifetime or so?
That's a very interesting question which I don't have an answer to. But one thing I want to say is now, after human genomics, we're now talking about psychosocial genomics, and which is part of epigenetics again, where it means that even though there are no changes in DNA, the influence of environment, the influence of all these practices can ultimately influence gene expression. So whether that is heritable or not is a question that we need to ask at some stage. So that's a good question.
Again, a little skeptical statement that looking at the good effects of meditation, we are looking at cortisol, this few things. I feel the effects are so huge and so enormous. Looking at one or two things, I think, is superfluous. And I remember Buddha said in a very short way, no self, no problem. So basically the whole story of Buddhism is to go transcend the duality of the mind and go to the source to see your true nature.
Yes,
And the moment you know your true nature, you have conquered it all. In fact, the thoughts are your problem. It seems in one of the satsangs, someone asked Buddha, where do the thoughts come from? Buddha didn't give an answer, but he gave a parable. He said, if someone shoots an arrow at you, do you chase the person who shot the arrow? What you have to do is just remove the arrow. So when you have thoughts which are disturbing you, you don't look at the source of the thoughts. You need to remove those thoughts which is causing pain. I think the whole process of meditation is like in computer age we use the refresh button. We constantly have to clean our screen of the mind. We need to refresh our button, and it's not from morning, afternoon, evening. I think it's throughout the day. Can we make our life meditative? Can we just witness the drama of life and say that we are just witnessing it and we're going to have fun looking at it and not be involved in it? Thank you.
Yeah, that is the true nature of the self as well as the purpose of meditation also. We see this is like, for example, to have some kind of objective measures. So we are just giving some examples of objective measures with which, we are providing some empirical evidences with which we can use these as tools to understand the Buddha's teaching. That is what we wanted to do it actually. See, for example, in Buddha's teaching, they explain about various aspects of self, various states of consciousness, and various aspects of well-being. So with this, with the to understand that maybe this, like these empirical evidences may help us. We are also not, in a reductionistic view. Yes, definite. Yes, correct.
I'd like to add something here. You see, there are outer, inner, and innermost practices. So at the outer practice, I may be having, how I wear my clothes and move around. At the inner level, how I, care about you, how nicely I'm talking, loving kindness, all these things. But at the innermost level, it is always watching my own mind. So if I'm going to sit for 20 minutes or half an hour or 1 hour meditating, that is just like a practice, because this has to be carried in real life. And that is what, when I said that we have to be constantly aware of, what is happening in my mind stream in terms of my thinking, my feeling, my beliefs, and of course then my actions. So when Atisha was asked, he says, what about your practice? He says, my outer practice, 100%. My inner practice, also 100%. Of bodhicitta, of the paramitas and all that. But of my innermost practice, he says it's like a plate in which there's a sandstorm which is blowing, and I keep on cleaning it and it keeps on getting covered, and I clean it and it keeps on getting covered. So it requires a lot of practice to do it, because my consciousness is beginningless, and the karma that I have generated is beginningless. So there will be that phase in which there will be a lot of work, mindfulness, that has to be practiced till the ocean becomes stiller and calmer. Otherwise there's a tempest.
Yeah, that is also the power of mind over the matter. That is the thing, actually. I think we will conclude the session, and I thank you all for your patient listening.